Laura serves with the Learning Institute and Foundation for Healthy Generations, which is a Seattle organization. She certainly has been involved with Washington State issues, and we have her involved because of the ACE interface. So the training we're going to do, we're going to be rely on Laura and Rob. So much of the information you hear today, we'll hear over and over again, repeated. So I'll leave it to Laura. We're going to push the agenda back just a little bit so we can have her information, and then we'll break for lunch after she's done.
Let's see, is there somebody to put this deck of slides up? The magnitude deck. There we go. Thank you. Okay, so I get the opportunity to talk to you about how when communities hold this amazing science, thank you, Rob, what happens in communities and how does change unfold so that you get a sense of your own future here as this initiative moves forward. So these issues that Rob has just talked about are really complex. There's historical trauma, the history of our people. There's intergenerational transmission of adversity. We know that ACEs accumulate. They rarely come in singles, right? They come in bundles, and the accumulation matters. We have sensitive developmental periods because our brains develop sequentially, in which we're extra sensitive to experience. We have a progression, unfortunately, of adversity throughout our lives. If we take the status quo and look at how people are living across their life course, unfortunately, our typical cultural patterns make ACEs worse. And we have huge public and private costs that as ACE scores are going up, we're starting to get feeling like the wave is crashing on us in terms of cost. And we have differences in communities, right? We have communities where ACE prevalence is higher and communities where ACE prevalence is a little lower, although ACEs are common in every community, in every state, every place where we've measured them. And so it can start to feel a little overwhelming to look at this complexity, and I think our systems have largely tried to peel this complexity apart into pieces and address the pieces, but we actually need to shift the whole of this picture, and that's what we're all about with this initiative. Our resources are finite. We have, especially in this period of time in history, we can't afford anymore to take these problems one by one by one. What ends up happening is we compete against one another instead of finding the high leverage places where we can shift the trajectory of health and safety, well-being and productivity. And we really need to find that leverage point in our work so that we're getting these measurable change at the population level. For so long, I've worked in state policy for many, many years, and for so long we've thought it was a big win when participants in a single program did better, and I want that for sure. But I am impatient. In my lifetime, I would like the whole population's health to be better. I don't think it's enough just to think about the participants in the few programs we can afford. So in order to have an impact, we focus in on this bundle of interrelated experiences that people have that affect children and families: abuse, neglect, family violence, substance abuse, criminal behavior, divorce, separation, and other kinds of relationship problems that expose children to fighting and anxiety, and then mental illness, depression, and suicide. When these are happening in households, the shape of the family is changing, the stress response of the children is going up. These are the ACEs that Dr. Anda studied. And so when we focus in on this bundle, we're looking at this constellation of factors as a whole instead of thinking about them one by one by one. And that's how we'll be able to have such a big impact on health. We're also looking at the intergenerational transmission of ACEs from one generation to another, and I think especially with this initiative, it's important to note that parental ACE scores are predictive of child ACE scores, except that we can interrupt that. Right? So these data that I have in front of you here are with the status quo, right? The way our society works now is generating 6.3 times more likely children are to experience household substance abuse if their parents have higher ACE scores. If their parents have higher ACE scores, they're 10 times more likely to experience homelessness, 12 or almost 13% more likely to experience neglect, and 44 times more likely to be exposed to intimate partner violence. So we know that working with parents to help them to hand to the next generation perhaps the greatest gift, the greatest legacy that they could leave for their family and for their community and for our nation is for parents to hand a lower ACE score to their children, right? A smaller number. And when we talk to audiences and take enough time for people to really process their own personal ACE history, often the most emotion that comes up in the room is from the people whose parents had high ACE scores and who have lower ACE scores themselves, because they've received this gift. It's an amazing gift to receive in the child generation. So what we're going to do here in Michigan is hand to parents the ability to give that gift and then stand by children as they receive it. We take a public health approach, and that means we're going to tell everyone, we're going to make sure this information is in the hands of every person, but it also means we're going to forge partnerships across disciplines and engage all of those disciplines in the shift at once, because many fields have a huge influence on the public's health, education, justice, health care, and on and on and on. And we're going to use this community capacity building approach, it's a public health approach, in order to improve people's connections with one another. Human beings are hardwired for belonging with one another, and we can help to create safer environments where people feel a sense of belonging in a way that comforts them and allows them to have the supports they need to pass lower ACEs on to the next generation. So this is a huge public health breakthrough. I think Dr. Filletti's study is the largest public health breakthrough of all time. And I oftentimes have a difficult time coming across audiences with how big it is. And so I started telling a short story here about another public health discovery that you're probably pretty familiar with, although you may not know many details about it. If you'd lived in the early 1800s in London, for example, you would have experienced waves of disease coming across the city and killing tens of thousands of people at a time. And the disease would come into the city and people would die, and then it would, all of a sudden, people would stop dying. And there were a lot of thoughts about why some people died and other people didn't die. Some of the guesses were people with bad beliefs or people with a family background that wasn't so good, those kind of guesses. But there was a majority view. There was a prevailing mental model about what was causing the deaths, and that was the smell in the air, miasma. And so they started to do things like cover up the troughs of open sewage running through the city, which probably was a pretty good idea now that we know more about what was causing these deaths. But they also did things like hang big iron grates in the city to burn incense because they were going to change the smell in the air. If you'd been friends at that time with Dr. John Snow, you would have heard him saying, you know, I can't line up all these facts because people aren't dying of lung symptoms, they're dying of intestinal symptoms. It can't be the smell in the air. There has to be something else going on. And this is the thinking pattern that allows us to open up the space. Are there whole other ways of thinking about something? And Dr. Snow was able to do that. And if you'd been his friend and you'd been tracking that conversation, you'd been thinking, I think he might be on to something. Maybe there's something else. Then in 1854, when the next wave of this death-producing, they thought miasma, came across London, Dr. Snow began to do something we call shoe leather epidemiology. He started putting an X on the map every time there was a death. And unfortunately, it didn't take very long, because you could wake up in the morning as a family and everybody could be well, and by nightfall, half of your family would have died. It didn't take long before there were lots of X's around one water pump, the Broad Street pump. So if he ran to your house and he had this map in his hand and he walked up those big stone steps in London and knocked on that big oak door and you opened it and he said, "I've got it, it's the water," what would you do? Stop drinking the water. Yeah, you stop drinking the water, and you'd probably tell some other people, don't drink the water out of the Broad Street pump, right? And in a huge public health discovery, that's the way we save lives. We tell everyone and we act in our own sphere of influence. If I'd been alive then, I would have done the same thing I would have told everyone, don't drink the water out of the Broad Street pump. That would have been my sphere of influence. But Dr. Snow also had the ability in his sphere of influence to order having the handle taken off the pump. And so each of us has a different sphere of influence. When we act within it, we don't have to wait for others to act. We act in our own sphere of influence, and when we have this massive dissemination of the information, we tell everyone, then everyone begins to act in their own sphere of influence. We get this elegant layering of strategy that is so powerful. And so that's how we save lives in a big public health discovery. It would be decades before germ theory was understood and accepted well enough for them to track that this was cholera, that there was bacteria in the water. It would be decades before we knew one river was contaminated and the other was not. It would be many decades before we started rebuilding the infrastructure, and over 100 years before we started having clean water law to assure water quality, and we still struggle with it today, as we know best in this state. So let's hold on to what we do in a major public health discovery as we think about the ACE study. We tell everyone and we act in our own sphere of influence. And as we take that action, I want us to think about these three protective spheres that resiliency researchers have identified as critical for helping the population to do well in the face of adversity. One of the spheres we want to improve is people's capabilities, things like their self-regulation, their positive view of themselves, and their skills. The second is their sense of attachment and belonging with other people. So critical, and the literature says attachment and belonging is important, but oftentimes we get the literature shortened to say if you just had one caring adult. And let me just say, the literature actually says caring and competent. And part of the competency is we need to produce safety around children, and we need to help them re-regulate when they've become hyper-aroused through a stress response. And the third sphere is the community, culture, spirituality, that sphere that's larger than ourselves, that sphere that Annette ended up leading in and is an amazing leader in her community, where everyone can contribute to this culture shift that we really want. We're investing in strengthening healthy networks of people, and we're living at a time where network theory is much better understood. We know the power of networks, and especially young people, that parenting age, is really very competent at using networks for not only conveying information, but for staying connected with one another. And when we use networks to build conversations that matter, what we're doing is we're helping people find their own strengths and learn how to act upon them, and realizing that other people have complementary strengths. So as a team, we're stronger than any of us as individuals. So I want to just take you through a journey of one community so you have a sense of what happens over time. This is a community in Washington. I had the great privilege of working with 42 communities, including 10 tribal communities, over 17 years in Washington. An unusual ability to see from a bird's eye view and also provide assistance and support to those communities over the course of the change. And we took the same approach you're taking, except I think you're taking it smarter in a lot of ways than we did, because of how quickly you're going to infuse this science into your communities. This is a place that's experienced a lot of natural disasters. It's a place that was highly affected by Mount St. Helens, our not-so-friendly volcano when it erupted. It was a place where the second largest mudslides in the United States history occurred, many, many homes wiped out. There's also a history of their cultural way of life being assaulted in some ways by federal policy. The end of the timber industry, the end of the mining industry, the end of the fishing industry as people knew it. And it wasn't just the jobs, it was our way of life that was disrupted in this community. This is a place with a large population that has experienced historical trauma in the history of their people, very high ACE prevalence, and a bimodal pattern where there's many people with 0 and 1 ACE and many people with 6 or more. And sometimes that can be a hard pattern in a community because you have groups of people that don't get each other. I don't get you. How come you're experiencing all these crises? I don't get you. How come you're not? Right? We have this gap. And it requires even more education. And this is also a place with really stunning success. So early on in those conversations where we were using conversation to build the network of activators in the community, we had a particular moment in time that I think of as a change moment for this community. We had sitting around the table, we actually had the sheriff, we had a couple deputies, we had educators, we had health providers, we had public health represented, and on and on. We had a multidisciplinary team, and more than half the people in the room were parents and other residents that weren't working in the formal system. And I was there only because they'd asked me to come and help them practice having really difficult conversations with that kind of mixture in the group. And I was facilitating the meeting, and I had opened the meeting saying, this is a place where we're going to talk about the toughest issues. That's part of what we do as community. And so let's go ahead and create the safety to do that. We'd spent some time early on in the meeting working on that. But there was a moment in the meeting where I stopped noticing my own self-regulation, and all of a sudden I find myself saying, okay, let's move on to the next topic. This is an indicator that maybe you're getting uncomfortable in case you don't. And one of the people in the meeting said, Laura, you said we weren't gonna just move on. We were gonna talk about the hardest issues. And I said, oh, I am so sorry. I think I've lost track of where I was emotionally. And the woman that was talking, I said, please, raise whatever issues that we need to talk about. And she said, every single person in this room except you, Laura, could drive you to the houses where parents are selling their children's bodies to get drugs. And we cried. That was a really hard moment. Law enforcement was shocked that people knew that. Health was shocked that people knew that, right? We often have secrets that we're holding as a community with shame. And creating the safety to bring out those hard conversations and really say, we actually want to be the adults that create safety for children. And at that moment, something shifted. Just like you heard Annette say, something at an individual level shifted for her, something in the community shifted in that. And they started really changing the way they were implementing strategy over time. So this is about an 8-year timeline, because at the time we had that meeting, they were already collaborating. They were already doing planning. They were purchasing services. Together in some cases in order to buy a better bundle. They were coordinating, they were co-locating. Some very impressive work was already happening in this community. But this work took them to the next level. And they started to infuse this education about ACE and related science through broad public education to everyone. They embedded it in professional development across the disciplines. They began to have population-specific and discipline-specific strategies. For example, the pediatrics clinic, the main pediatrics clinic in one of the largest towns, began to incorporate some conversations in the regular developmental screening. And also one of the pediatricians eventually was trained as a master trainer and now delivers education locally in his own community. And their third phase was they started doing cross-training. They noticed who had relationships with the families and with the parents that likely had high ACE scores. And how do we guess? We can see the shadow of the high ACE score in the groups that have higher ACE attributable problems, right? When we are looking at a population, we're looking at the medical data, and we see a group of people that have co-occurring mental, physical, behavioral, and other kinds of problems in their lives, we likely are looking at a population with higher ACE scores. So we don't have to collect the information necessarily in order to be able to see something about who. So they started saying who has relationship, and they cross-trained those professionals so that they could be also advocates in the schools, so that they could also provide coaching and support at the neighborhood level. And they started generating parent leadership in a whole new way. They also decided they would take neighborhoods where they had high concentrations of ACE attributable problems. We can see that through the 911 call rate, right? We don't have to wait till we have all the perfect data. We can see reflections of this in our data that we already have. And they had neighborhood-specific mobilization efforts in those neighborhoods. And there was a turning point, a tipping point in this community that told us that their rates of problems were going to come down. And this is a tipping point when they had been writing reports to my office where they were talking about, we're going to deliver programs to parents because we wish parents had better skills and abilities, and so we, the professional, will teach them. And then this report came to our office. We're going to improve parent skills so parents can give sound advice and be good mentors to their children. And in turn, they'll gain skills and relationships to give sound advice to our community. And their advice will make a better system of help for them and for other families. You see, that turned it on its head, where parents now are the leaders. Parents now have the power and the respect to change the trajectory in the community. And that led to whole new ways of working, where they had networking cafes on a regular basis where parents were leading parent-to-parent dialogue. They had learning field trips to other communities so parents could meet and look at leadership in other places. They established a time bank so low-income parents could purchase things with their time and skills and effort, and created a whole new economy among parents and more. So let me just show you a little bit of what happens in a community when we see this shift. This combination of we teach everyone, we tell everyone, and everyone acts in their sphere of influence. These are charts. The green lines are the community I've been talking about, Cowlitz County, and the red lines are the Washington State data on these same indicators. So on the left of the screen, you see child injury hospitalizations. This is a rate between 94 and 12, so we're looking at trend over time data. You see much better trends in child injury hospitalizations, this plummeting of suicides and suicide attempts, a reduction in hospitalizations of all ages, a reduction in alcohol arrests in the time when law enforcement was getting tougher and tougher and tougher to keep kids safe. We saw this rapid decline in infant mortality crossing the state rate, and we saw a reduction in juvenile offenses. Now, these are the kinds of things we would expect to see, because we understand when you're addressing that complex bundle, you should see the rates of many problems come down at once. And this is only one community out of many where we've seen this occur. It takes about 8 to 10 years on our slow pace. My prediction is it will happen faster here because you have a more organized and systematic plan, and you have so many people engaged in the effort. So we learned a couple of things. We learned that 4 factors were really critical in places where we saw these rates come down. Leadership, the idea that we expand and we include more people and we think of them as leaders, not just positional leaders, but the residents of the community and the parents are leaders. That we intentionally create safe opportunities for people to talk about matters of real importance to them. that we're learning together. This science is new. We don't have all the answers. So communities set up ways to learn and observe and change over time. And then lastly, that periodically we step back and reflect on, we now have a new status quo and we think it's awesome and we're really proud of it. And what are the outcomes? Because if they're not good enough, then we need to take another step, even though we're proud. Let's not get stuck with outcomes we won't really satisfy us as the legacy we want to live. Because culture really actually matters. You know, the tacit patterns and rules and all of that that causes us to live with one another in particular ways day by day is really critical for this shift in public health. And when we're actually trying to shift culture, we need to take it off of autopilot and bring it up into the conscious level and be able to talk about that. And it's critical here because we simply don't have the resources to only use direct service programming because ACEs are just simply too common. So we're going to take this trauma-informed approach. We're going to understand the prevalence. You've taken a big step in Michigan toward that. We're going to recognize how it affects people, and that your master trainers and many of the experts I've already met in this state are working hard at that. We're going to shift our systems so that there's more safety and we're resisting re-traumatization, and we're going to tell everyone and act in our sphere of influence. One of the major tools you're using is the train the trainer, our speakers, who are talking everywhere from ballrooms to living room conversations. So a part of what you can do in your sphere of influence is, as we train more and more people, it's to invite them to share the science. And we know from our juvenile court data that we have to work the data in order to understand that pathway. Dr. Anda shared with you that in the juvenile court, we were able to look at the data and see that our kids with higher ACE scores began to be suspended from school in 2nd grade. That, working the data to discover that, allowed a completely new kind of partnership between the juvenile court and the schools. So we need to work the data to learn what these pathways are so that we can effectively interrupt them. Prevention happens at 3 levels, I think. One is ourselves. We begin to manage our own selves better. You know, from that moment when I almost shifted the conversation away from the very most important thing we could talk about because I felt uncomfortable, I don't do that as much anymore, right? Because I'm managing myself differently. We also are working on shifting the practices, our trauma-informed practices, and the web of connections and partnerships across disciplines. And lastly, we're shifting the context of people's lives, their community, cultural context, which needs to be safer and more supportive and more trauma-informed. So as I close, I just want to say that for years and years I've talked about this bundle of science, this neuroscience, epigenetics, ACEs, and resilience. But in the last few years I'm beginning to think that when we talk about resilience, we're setting our sights too low. Because resilience means doing well in the face of great adversity. And I don't know about you, but I'm ready for less adversity. And I believe that all of us can be on a journey, on a pathway to doing better. So I've been thinking about this word flourish or flourishing, because to flourish means to prosper with sustained and continuous and steady and strong, growing into well-being. It's a journey word. And we can all be on that pathway regardless of our own personal ACE history. We can be on the journey to flourishing, and we can also notice when other people step off that and make sure we're offering more support around them. So Dr. Bessel van der Kolk, he is one of the leaders in trauma-informed care and research in our nation, and he says that restoring relationship and community is central to restoring well-being, and that human beings are maybe uniquely able to do this because we have language, and language gives us the power to change ourselves and the narrative of our lives, like Dr. Anda talked about, and we can find meaning with other people that way. We have the ability to regulate our own physiology with really basic activities that everyone can do, like breathing, moving, touching, tuning. to one another. And we can change social conditions that create the environments so that people feel safer and they can be on that journey to flourish. So I want to close by thanking you for welcoming us in your amazing journey. I'm so excited. I think the strategies you're putting in place are exactly right and leading strategies for our nation. I think all over the country people will be watching Michigan. I'm so excited to see you use this three-tiered strategy of people changing themselves, people changing the disciplines that they work in and the practices that are used, and people understanding the science well enough to shift to a culture of well-being in Michigan. So thank you.